This is Euroscopic, a podcast brief about what happened this week, how we got here, and where we're going. I'm William Bluecroft.
And this is Martin Gack.
You can find this podcast and other essays at our Substack, euroscopic.substack.com. And of course, you can subscribe wherever your ears go for podcasts. Like, comment, share, you know the drill. If you like it, let us know, and a friend or two of yours as well. This episode was recorded on Thursday, the 31st of August, 2023.
You seem to be in perfectly good shape.
Oh, good. I'm glad I look that way. I feel a bit tired. I seem to have caught something that is going around, which is a thing that, like, sometimes you feel fine and sometimes you feel sick, and it just kind of oscillates back and forth. So that's
strange, and it sounds very unpleasant.
Yeah, it's a very strange thing. So I'm just kind of staying home and taking it easy, and hopefully I can be as sharp-witted and delightful for our audiences as they've come to expect.
So something very curious happened to me last week. I went to a colleague's farewell in a bar here in the center of Berlin, and I attempted to order a beer. I attempted to order it, and the guy looked at me completely puzzled and said, no, in English, please. And this is happening throughout sort of the center of Berlin, a bit less sort of towards the peripheries, which is creating a strange kind of inverted ghetto situation in which Germans are kind of locked out of certain commerces and are locked out of certain sort of activity unless they can actually interact in the English as a lingua franca.
Well, of course. I mean, I write a lot about this on my own over on my, Schland Substack about the sort of the dual track nature of what it means to be foreign in Germany. If you're a upwardly mobile professional class person belonging to the Anglo-American side of things, regardless if you're a native English speaker or not, but at least if you participate in those or swim in those waters, you're cut a lot more slack. You'll be considered an expat and therefore get away with all kinds of things that lower class, working class immigrants and descendants of those immigrants could never get away with, the kinds of things that those people would be considered a Parallelgesellschaft, a parallel society, kind of ghettoizing themselves and seen as a threat to mainstream society. The other people, the English-speaking side, the Anglo side or the Anglicized side, is sort of bowed down to as something to strive for, to aspire to. The argument you make is exactly the argument Jens Spahn made in 2017, and it was roundly criticized for it. Jens Spahn, internationally probably better known for being the health minister during the pandemic, but before that, just a lawmaker in Angela Merkel's conservative party. He is a conservative, and he made a point, rightly so, that there shouldn't be places in Berlin where it's fine to speak English and be able to speak English, but to only speak English is actually, contrary to a sign of cosmopolitanism, is actually just provinciality in a different form.
Anyway, yeah. What are the stories for this week?
It's not just the increased traffic on the streets and more kids on the streets going, now that school's back in Berlin, that have shown me that summer is officially over. We are now in the full fall phase, but also that the news agenda is just suddenly busier and more crowded. So we have a lot of stuff to talk about. There is more fallout on the Tunisia deal, something that you and I talked about, I think, way back in our very first episode. And the big thing we want to talk about is this week, a big milestone in the Digital Services Act, which potentially has some major ramifications for the internet, which is, as we know, primarily an American industry, given that all the major internet companies are American. Before we get to those really big ones, let me turn it back over to Martin for some other stories this week that you've been seeing.
So this week, the PP, the conservatives that do not have the numbers to form government in Spain, and they know that, they turn to Sanchez, the socialist in power, and they ask him if he would allow them to rule for 2 years, which would be essentially half a term. This was Feijóo, one of the strangest requests that I have seen in European politics in a very long while, reminiscent a little bit of the Israeli deal that was struck between...
I was just going to say that.
It seems that the rebuke for the conservatives in Spain was actually pretty quickly. I mean, newspapers across the country saying this is really just nonsense, and clearly that is also has been pretty much a reaction of the socialists. They are still trying to court, you know, the independentist votes from around the country, and one of the things that they have actually offered was the recognition of regional languages as official parts of the language charter of Spain.
If I understood correctly, that would not only be at the Spanish level, that would be at the European level, because they would become official European languages, which would add all kinds of layers of bureaucracy and translation by adding new languages in Brussels. Am I correct?
Very, very much so. But basically, you would potentially go into the parliament, give your speech in Basque, and now you would have to have a very large number of translators that can translate not only between Basque and English or Basque and French, but also Basque and Hungarian, Basque and Polish, so on and so forth.
One of the smaller stories of the week was the UK's technical oopsie. I believe the official word was glitch in their air traffic control system. Flights in and out of the UK for a couple days actually were heavily delayed, if not grounded, due to simply an error in their system, which is for me pretty frightening. Just how thin the line is between, you know, functional society and complete, post-apocalyptic shutdown of social processes. You know, like one little glitch in a system. And that's even assuming everybody's best interests, assuming there aren't bad actors out there intentionally looking to take down systems. Just how, you know, vulnerable, how thin the ice is on which our modern societies walk.
A serious migrant crisis of the 2015 type could quite literally push things like the AfD, could actually underpin the further move of Orban and people like that. You could find yourself in 2024 with an Orban Commission, which is staffed by people that belong to, say, Vox from Spain, Fratelli d'Italia in Italy, PIS in Poland, and a couple of maybe CDU, like sort of Christian Democrats from Germany that have made a deal with the devil, and a couple of PP people in Spain that have made a deal with the devil as well, and had been sort of given different positions inside the commission. So it is really not a small thing when you look at the way that the 2015 crisis has actually really pushed the dial to the right. Right? I mean, everybody understands, I think, that the situation is extremely critical.
Which brings us kind of the other side of this coin, which is €1 billion is a lot of money for anybody. It's especially a lot of money for a country like Tunisia. Essentially a payoff telling Tunisia, here's a bunch of money, keep the migrants out of Fortress Europe. And major European political figure, Max Weber, who is the head of the European People's Party, this grouping of center-right parties around Europe in the European Parliament, he went to Tunisia, had kind of a state visit there, met with leaders there. Tunisia, which of course is increasingly being criticized for backtracking on democracy, for cracking down on free speech, for increasing police state-like tactics against its own people and certainly against foreigners. Max Weber had this strange kind of two-sided lesson to bring to Tunisia. One, make this work. You know, we're giving you a lot of money and we want to see results. But also, hey, you know, what else are we supposed to do? We can't dictate to other countries how they run their internal affairs. This is realpolitik. Not all places are nice. And it might not be nice, but this is the way the world works. It actually quite reminded me of Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, when there was the question of whether Germany would boycott the Olympics in China. And he essentially had the same answer, saying, look, the world is not a nice place. We have to deal with people how they are, not the way we want them to be.
I think that what is disingenuous about the Weber position is essentially that, you know, what you're doing is not quite simply engaging with people that might not be particularly nice. You're quite literally like supporting them and underwriting their operation by putting €1 billion in, and essentially with what very likely will be very little control and very little oversight.
I think we can slightly shift gears to two other stories of sort of interests versus values at the European level. One of those is this report from Global Witness that Russian LNG gas imports are not only not down, they're actually up by the very countries that are, said they are swearing them off.
Yes, by 40%, actually. No small number, right?
Right. Yes, 40% in comparison to the year just prior to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
You are basically putting money into the pockets of somebody that is using that money to, shoot on Ukrainian civilians. And you're doing this while claiming that you're not doing this and that have stopped doing this.
And that you stand for the people getting shot at.
Obviously, I think that the real political calculation here is somewhat similar to the previous question, the one with immigration, which is you cannot really get away from Russia in terms of energy. You cannot really get away from Tunisia in terms of immigration, or Turkey in terms of immigration, without benefiting Turkey, Russia, or Tunisia.
So at the same time we have, Russian LNG gas flowing in, economic crisis or potential crisis in the European Union, especially in big places like Germany, which in response, Germany as well as France are looking to subsidize their big industry that are huge energy consumers. Sure. And I want to make clear there's a difference between gas and oil and heat and electricity. I want to make that clear, obviously, so it's not completely apples to apples. But in any case, looking to subsidize these legacy industries to keep them in their countries, Germany and France, respectively. France, of course, wants to subsidize nuclear power because it's totally pro-nuclear. Germany is religiously against, almost like a cult, against nuclear power. Both sides trading accusations against the other for trying to manipulate the market. And of course, both of them easily, if they go through with any kind of these subsidies, could be violating EU, if not WTO, subsidy rules.
Where do you think that the subvention is going?
Well, if past this prologue, normally what happens at the European level is some kind of meek compromise is worked out after many hours and many rounds in a back room somewhere in Brussels, where everyone kind of walks away with a little bit of what they want. Germany will in some way be allowed to subsidize its industries, call it some kind of economic crisis or emergency fund stopgap funding measure. Somehow there'll be a loophole made, and I'm sure there'll be some kind of allowance made for France as well. It's kind of ridiculous that we're talking about these additional subsidies when German industry and consumers, individual residents, are already massively subsidized in their heating bills since last winter with a gas, with a heating and electricity break, so to speak, a price break, which is sort of like a cap. So to the tune of 200 billion euros, the kind of money that Germany can spend / borrow that other countries simply cannot, because just their economies and their debt borrowing kind of allowances won't allow for it. The financial markets won't allow for it in the way that they'll allow Germany to be able to borrow. Does this then turn industries into so-called zombie economies where companies and sectors that should go the way of the dodo, no offense to the dodo, linger on and getting in the way of innovation, of new technologies, of new industries, new sectors, which funny enough is something that in Germany, the Free Democrats, the FDP, the Liberal Party, loves to champion, loves to talk about innovation, startups, new technologies, new innovation, but they're the party most in favor of tax breaks for major companies. 7 billion euros was just passed in tax breaks in Germany. So it's a very interesting push and pull situation. Also, it's politics, not exactly something we could say that hypocrisy is any stranger to. The Digital Services Act, which has been a long time coming, but this week sees a major milestone in terms of it coming into force and companies having to comply with it. And Martin, I think you've especially been reading into some of the details, so maybe you can give us the breakdown of what exactly the DSA is all about.
The DSA is a very strange animal that I've been following for at least a year and a half or so. The Digital Service Act is essentially a way to bring rules directly to bear on the platforms. The platforms now are essentially demanded to implement ways to prevent false postings, the distribution and sales of illegal goods, for instance, false content, abusive content, and so on and so forth. And they also are required to define ways in which users can report these things. Now, the possible penalty now is 6% of the daily global income of a company. The attempt is to find a way to actually make all companies that have more than essentially 45 million monthly users in the EU essentially take up the rules and enforce them.
This is where the EU shines, right? That's, it doesn't have a military. It can't impose its will militarily. It can't impose its will even financially. But it can impose its will in a regulatory way because it's such a big block, 450 million people altogether, a GDP, it's lagging behind where it should be in comparison to the US, but a massive GDP when taken all together. So it can pass regulations that, although technically only apply to the EU, because we live in a globalized, interconnected society, it would cost companies a lot of money to make one set of services and goods for the European Union and another for the rest of the world. So the idea being, well, we already have to make things a certain way for the EU. We'll just make them the same way for all around the world, whether that's fuel efficiency for cars, the kinds of plugs that we have for our phones to charge them, and now this kind of data protection, security, and really competition. There is, of course, an economic aspect to this as well, because America just blows the European Union out of the water when it comes to digital innovation, internet companies, etc. This is also a protectionist measure to help European companies compete and level the playing field with these massive American firms that can just steamroll any potential competition within the European Union.
The overwhelming presence of American companies has also meant essentially you put it in terms of steamrolling, but has meant the freezing of European development, because many of these companies have had really very strong predatory approaches. I still do expect essentially European innovation development to be the only serious solution to actually the kind of things that you see coming out of the US or coming out of China or coming out of Russia and the Middle East in some cases.
Of course, the counter argument here is the whole reason that the internet exists, the reason these companies have become so powerful, the reason we have Google search at all, the reason we have Facebook at all is exactly because there aren't the data protection regulations. The internet is built and it is free, so to speak, at least from a financial point of view, is free because in exchange, we take your data and we profit off of your data and we do all kinds of unseemly things for it. And that is the deal that consumers make with these internet platforms. And none of this would be possible if the kinds of EU regulations existed in America in the first place. There never would be a Google. There never would be a Facebook. Now, we can have an economic and a moral argument about whether that's a good thing. Contrary to my own vested interests in the internet, given my job and given this very podcast, I might come down on the side that we'd all be a lot better off without all of it. But nonetheless, it'd be a very different world if from the onset, 30, 40 years ago, when all these ideas started kicking into gear, when the internet of today was really getting going, if these rules were out there to begin with.
The point here is that we have law and we have terms of services. And I think this is an attempt by the European Union to make the law stand above the terms of services. So in a way, this really is a power struggle of different bodies of regulations and norms. It's not merely that when you have the violation of, let's say, privacy rules, or when you have the violation of political rights, Facebook being used and the money that is being put by, European advertisers in Facebook is being used indirectly to support, let's say, massive human rights violations or the persecution of minorities in India. The law in Europe is European law, and the law that guides or that rules over our actions is European law, and it cannot be the terms of services.
This Digital Services Act is just one big part of a kind of a long-running ecosystem of various rules, regulations, massive bodies of law that the EU's been trying to do for years. We have the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, which is almost a curse word for some people, which basically came into effect in 2018 and made everybody, from the biggest fish to the tiniest tadpoles, have to suddenly comply with all kinds of data protection at risk of some very serious fines. You also have what used to be known as Safe Harbor, now is just eerily called the framework, like some bad, made-for-TV movie between the EU and the US, exactly because the internet is dominated by American companies. So much of the data is stored and processed in the US on US servers outside of the EU jurisdiction, where all kinds of unsavory things can happen, according to from a European viewpoint, like espionage, like the NSA tapping into it and mining data of European citizens.
I think so it's the collapse of the Safe Harbor Agreement, which came in the heels of the NSA scandal, in which we find out that the NSA was actually spying on European leaders, particularly in Germany. It was noteworthy that they had tapped into, they had bugged Merkel's cell phone, among other things. And it was very clear after the NSA, particularly sort of around WikiLeaks and so on, that American companies could not give two shits about it, that they did not respect it. Because the fact is that in European political circles, nobody trusts the Americans. So I think that in a way, what I see here is Europe kind of waking up, but the wake up process is extremely, excruciatingly slow.
Martin, what loose end of yours is there to tie up?
Well, the main one I was looking at was Estonia, where actually it turns out Kallas, who has been denouncing, the prime minister, who has been denouncing Russia, the Russian invasion, Russian activity, Russian commercial relations, etc. It turns out that her husband is still actually operating and has investments in Russia. And not only that, she herself had invested out of her own pocket into her husband's fund. So she herself is actually operating in Russia. That has obviously has pushed the opposition to ask for her resignation and clarifications and so on.
I do wonder how much of this is just, small town politics, opposition looking for any excuse to call for the resignation of the prime minister. At least what I was reading, what I've looked into so far, it doesn't look good. It was a little bit stupid to still have these Russia ties, but they were indirect ties. It's a little bit unclear just how heavily involved either the prime minister or her husband were in Russia. Nonetheless, in a moment, in a particularly sensitive moment like this, you have to just double and triple check your connections to make sure you don't come off appearing disingenuous. Nonetheless, it would be a good time for maybe for her and her husband to skip off to Slovenia, where there's a current meeting this week of Central and European thought leaders, as they like to say in the industry speak, political leaders, officials, business people, to talk about, your classic kind of business conference, to talk about the next steps, how Central and European countries can, work better together.
The bigger one that I'm looking at is actually Gabon, which is the latest coup in, Francophone Africa. I must say, for transparency's sake, that I worked in the presidential campaign of Bruno Mubamba against Ali Bongo, who was just deposed. It turns out that Mubamba, the guy I was working with, ended up becoming a minister for Bongo. But the thing that is most interesting about this story, besides the fact that it sounds perhaps like just one more coup in Francophone Africa, is that Gabon is a major producer of oil. And as a matter of fact, it is the place where a lot of the total extraction happens. It also has a lot to do also with Russian interest in the region. There is an established presence, mainly apparently the Wagner group, even now after his boss's death, which in theory has directly moved to belong or to depend on the Russian state. So it's no longer mercenary or an independent or a private army.
I am curious to see how the death of its founder and boss is going to affect its operations and Russia's, power projection in these regions. If Wagner falls apart, if Wagner is not able to be successfully incorporated into the official state security apparatus in Russia, if any comes to pass, we could actually see a weakening of Russian influence in these parts of the world if they can't hold on to their interests like they once could with the helping hand of the Wagner mercenary group. Maybe that's wishful thinking from a Western and specifically French point of view, but it will be interesting to see how that develops in the time to come.
You've been listening to Euroscopic with William Bluecroft and Martin Gack, written by us, produced by us, and edited by me. If you liked what you heard, like us, subscribe to us, leave us a comment, tell us what you think, and share us with a friend. You can find us at Substack, that's euroscopic.substack.com, and our podcast wherever podcasts are heard. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll catch you next week.